So welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about Megillat Esther, the Book of Esther, and we're going to be looking at it in terms of, I do want to kind of go back to the Persian chronology and say, just to talk about a little bit about historically where the book is almost placing itself, you could say, and then kind of what it does share in common with what we know about the Persian Empire and the way people wrote about the Persian Empire. And also talk about some parallelisms we see with other books, with other biblical books from the period and in general. So I'm going to start with looking at the chronology. Now, I sent this to you by email, but I'm also going to share my screen. So with no further ado, let us do that. Here we are. Okay. All right, can you see my screen? You see the Persian period relevant chronology? Yeah? Just nod? Yeah, cool. Okay, great. So here we have, I said, let's start from what's relevant really for, especially for Megillat Esther, right? Because when is Mordechai supposedly exiled? He's exiled in the exile of Yehoiachin. Yehoiachin is the initial exile of kind of nobility. That's before the book of Yechezkel, right? Yechezkel speaks to the Babylonian exiles who are the initial group of Babylonian exiles. That's who Yechezkel speaks to in Bavel, right? In Babylonia. So that, and the Megillah tells us, right? The Book of Esther tells us that Mordechai is with that group. So when did that exile happen? That exile happened in 597. The actual temple is destroyed in 586. Of course, that gap is because there's a puppet king set up, Tzidkiyahu, right? He's set up to be the king and be loyal to Babylonia. Of course, he is not loyal to Babylonia. He rebels along with with his allies to a certain extent, and that's it. It's destroyed, and there's a final exile from Jerusalem. Now that exile actually really does not last very long. Right, the exile happens in 580. The final, you could say, exile happened in 586. Babylonia is conquered by Cyrus the Persian in 539. All right, and then in 538, Cyrus lets the Jews, and I think let's say Jews or Judeans, go home. Right, he says, okay, you can go back. That's under Sheshbatzar, right? That's in Ezra. That's as in the beginning of Ezra. Then we have Cambyses, or as we call it in Hebrew, Cambuzi, right? Persia captures Egypt. Now, at this point, when we read that in the Megillah, that the empire is Mehodu Viad Kush, from India to Nubia, that is in fact the maximum size of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire at its height, in fact, includes from India, it includes India and goes all the way to Nubia, which is insane. If you look on a map, right, and you just keep zooming out, right, it's crazy that you had this empire that actually covered this entire area, and it really did, okay? But moving along, because I'm going to come back to some other things like that the Megillah reflects that were actually like features of the Persian Empire. Then there was the revolt after the death of Cambyses or Cambuzi, and Darius rises to power. 522 to 486, we have Darius, and that's when we have the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. Okay. Then Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I. Under Artaxerxes I, we have Nehemiah. We have, put it this way, we all did, many of us did Ezra and Nehemiah together, did those books together. And what we saw was, it looks like, first of all, it looks like Nehemiah and Ezra did not rule at the same time. It looks like they were not actually together, even though there's one verse where they are there's one place in the book where they're kind of placed together, but it seems a little artificial. In most places where you'd expect Ezra to be popping into Nehemiah's story or Nehemiah to pop into Ezra's story, they don't. They have two separate stories. However, they both serve under an Artaxerxes. However, we have a whole bunch of Artaxerxeses, that they could serve under. It seems from the list that we have at the end of Ezra and Nehemiah of the high priests, with the genealogy of high priests, Nehemiah's high priest is before Ezra's high priest. So it seems like Nehemiah served earlier and Ezra served later. And that's what this reflects. So there's Nehemiah, there's Darius II. Under Darius II, we have the famous Passover letter from Elephantine. Those are the Jewish troop serving the Persian Empire in Nubia, right, in Elephantine. So that's under Darius II, and the letter about rebuilding the temple of the Jews of Elephantine, of Yev. Artaxerxes II is probably when we have Ezra. Maybe, again, at this point we're kind of guessing. If you really want to put them, Nehemiah and Ezra, and both are in the same Artaxerxes, go ahead. Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes IV, Alexander the Great conquers Egypt. Okay, and end of the Persian period, beginning of the Hellenistic period. All right, now so the Persian period is really, 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 really long. Okay, we have I shouldn't say really, really long, it depends what you consider long, but you're talking about 200 years. Okay, 200 years. The Seder Olam Rabbah, which is the midrash that tries to create a chronology from the beginning of the world, a biblical chronology that dates from the beginning of the world. When we have the year number, we get it from Seder Olam Rabbah. He compresses the Persian period into 52 years, 34 years after the rebuilding of the second Beit Mikdash. And he does this by saying that Artaxerxes means your majesty. And that way he can get to a lot fewer kings. He says Artaxerxes is not the name of a king, it's your majesty. The Artaxerxes of Nehemiah is actually Darius, like that. So he really compresses everything. That helps. Now, part of the reason he's compressing it is also because Ezra and Nehemiah also kind of presented as if there are two important generations, right? There's Sheshbatzar, yeah, he's the one who rules when they come in, but then you have Zerubbabel and Yehoshua. That's one important generation, and the other important generation is Ezra and Nehemiah. That's where everything happens in the book. But if we kind of unpack the book, it's pretty easy to see that not only are Ezra and Nehemiah probably different generations, or not at the same time, put it that way, there's also quite a gap between the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls, right? Where we have these kings in between who are like, hell no, you're not rebuilding the walls, okay? And one of these kings who are like, hell no, you're not rebuilding the walls, is Xerxes, who we normally connect with Achashverosh. We connect him with Achashverosh because it's called Achashverosh in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we have Achashverosh saying no to the walls, and the temple's already rebuilt. Okay. I'm going to remind you, anyone who wasn't in the class with me, the last year's class, that we think of the big deal in Ezra and Nehemiah being the rebuilding of the temple. And of course, it is a big deal, but it's not as big a deal as the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. And the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem is what is really dangerous and difficult and really raises the ire of the nations around the Judeans. Okay. The temple, no one's upset about it, really. The biggest kind of conflict that we see, like, yes, in the beginning of the book, you have this thing, they're building the temple and other people want to build it with them. They're like, we serve the same God. And they're like, tough noogies. We don't care if you serve the same God. You don't get to build the temple with us. Go away, right? And then it says they didn't build the temple because they were scared of the enemies of Sarei, Yehuda, and Benjamin, right? Enemies of Yehuda and Benjamin, using a very general term. And the next thing we know, when they do in fact build the temple, now I'm going to go back to our chronology here. So they come back under Sheshbatzar. Where do we have here? Under Sheshbatzar, they come back. Okay, they do in fact build the altar. They build an altar. Okay, they have that altar, which is a functioning altar. Okay, but they don't build the temple. There's a real gap between when they come back and when they build the temple. And from Ezra and Nehemiah, what you would understand is they didn't build it because of the threat of the other nations. If we read Haggai, Haggai and Zechariah are the ones who are like, guys, you got to build the temple now. From what Haggai is saying, the real reason they're not building the temple, at least at that point, is because of poverty. They don't have wood for themselves, so why would they use wood for a temple? Now, I want you to notice, okay, how short the exile was pretty darn short, right? You have the exile is 586. I mean, it's longer than you want, because no one wants an exile, right? But I don't mean to like diminish it that way, right? It's a lot longer than I was exiled for, put it that way, right? But it's from 586 to 538. Okay, so so it's under 50 years. We haven't gotten to the 70 years, right? That was promised to Yirmiyahu. It's like in 70 years you're going to get back. It's under 70. But once we get to the rebuilding the temple, that's around 70. That's close to 70 years. Okay. And that's what's going on there. What's going on there probably was they're like, guys, 70 years, we need to rebuild, right? And that's probably what provided at least part of the impetus to say, we've got to rebuild now, okay? Now, so here, so according, if you just look at Haggai, it's like the reason they aren't rebuilding is because they're poor. Then if you go back to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they in fact do build, are they threatened by surrounding peoples? They are not. The ruler of the entire area comes to visit, and he's like, guys, what are you doing? And they're like, we're rebuilding the temple. And it's like, what is this? They're like, we have permission from Cyrus. And he writes to Darius, and he says to Darius, can you check in the archives to see if they have permission from Cyrus? And meanwhile, he lets them keep building. He doesn't stop them from building, right? He doesn't stop them from building, and this is important. He doesn't stop them from building. They keep building while the archives are being checked, which means it's not that big a danger. He doesn't see it as this big deal, right? That's got to be shut down. They keep building, and Darius checks the archives, and he's like, for sure, they have permission. I'm sending stuff. Clearly, they didn't build it because they didn't have the means. So I am giving money, and they should bring sacrifices for me and my son, right? Me and my children. And the temples, rebuilding the temple is relatively smooth. What is not relatively smooth is building the walls. When Nehemiah tries to build the walls, that's when you get threats from the surrounding people. You have assassination attempts. You have all sorts of things going on. Everyone has to arm themselves. While they're building, they're carrying swords. They have guards. It's dangerous and a mess, right? And that's the big challenge of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, is rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. Now, this actually brings me to one of my first interesting parallels of Nehemiah and Esther, but I will pause and look at the questions to see, do I have? Okay. I'm looking at your questions. Okay. Where is Purim there? Where is Purim in the chronology? Purim is not, okay, so I'm going to take your question at face value. When was Purim instituted? Okay, by when do we know there must have been a Purim? Well, there must have been something before 160 BCE. Okay, so 160 BCE or 160, 161 is the Battle of Nicanor. The Battle of Nicanor is one of the Maccabean battles. Okay, and it was a big one. It was such a big one that the author of Second Maccabees thought that was it. He thought, once we win against Nicanor, that's it, we won. And now we can all rest and celebrate. But in fact, the fighting went on for many more years. But the temple had already been reconsecrated at that point. So the book of Second Maccabees was actually written in order to commemorate the day of Nicanor. And he said, and when do we celebrate the day of Nicanor? We celebrated the day before the day of Mordechai. Okay. So we know there was a day of Mordechai. We know there was a Purim that everyone knew about, right? In 160 BCE. Okay, that's that is from an academic standpoint, that is a date that we can kind of point to and say, aha, Purim, right? Not Tanit Esther, by the way. The fast of Esther clearly is not bothering anyone, right? Because he's instituting a holiday the day before Purim, which now is a fast day. And no one's like, but it's a fast day. It wasn't a fast day, okay? So you have the day of Nicanor. I believe it was last year that I was sick on Tanit Esther, so instead I celebrated the day of Nicanor. It was nice. I don't get to do it often. at any rate, so we know that there was a Purim then, okay? Was there a Megillah then, right? So everyone dates the Megillah differently academically. Again, from the point of view of tradition, of course there was. From the point of view of tradition, you are going to have to say that somewhere around here, this is the problem. If we say Ahasuerus was Xerxes, all right, we have a problem, because the way the story goes, Mordechai is one of the exiles with Yehoiachin, okay? So he is, oh, sorry, everyone sees the chat. It's okay. So here we have the exile of Yehoiachin, okay? And that supposedly includes Mordechai, right? That's 597. Okay, the way the story is told is as if the temple is not standing, right? That's how it sounds. Okay, can you say no? Actually, it is standing, and these are the guys who stayed in Persia. I think you can. I think if you're pushed to it, I think you can. And then you would have to say, well, it's happening. It can happen anytime. It has to happen within a lifetime of the exile of Yehoiachin, right? You say a lifetime. So you could say he was a little toddler, and he was exiled. And so let's say he was 2, and so that would be 599, right? And let's say he's an old guy now. He's 90. Right? So that would take us to, it could just almost to Xerxes there, right? Almost. It'd be hard, right? Okay. So couldn't you do that? It's really pushing it. If he's 95, I think maybe we can make it, right? It's not really. He's got to be really old. He's got to be really old, have a nice long life, and have left pretty young to get to our historical Xerxes. Okay. Now you could also say, well, this was one of these. There are a lot of different. By the way, you say Xerxes the first. Where is Xerxes the second here? And that's why I have this chronology of Persian kings. Xerxes the second ruled for 45 days. Right? Persia had a lot of very difficult kind of transitions between kings. Okay, so that can be a bit of an issue. So you could say, well, maybe they're talking about a different. It's very difficult to say where Purim is. If you need to take this thing and put Purim in somewhere, you'll have to say that it's around here, I guess. Okay. And you can kind of push it if you say Mordechai is really, 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 really old. All right. And you'll have to say the temple's already standing. Okay. It's pushing it, but you can do it. I think, particularly if you're allowing Mordechai to be super old, right? 110, right? And then you would have to say, then traditionally you would say, okay, that's when Purim starts. Purim starts right after that happens. Of course, the problem is that there's no record of anything like that happening in the Persian Empire. This is the problem that we get into with Esther, that we only started getting into with the rest of biblical chronology recently, right? Because only recently are people saying, wait, that doesn't match the historical record, or that doesn't match the archaeological record when we go way back in biblical history, right? This is a problem, by the way, that Christians had in the New Testament right away, because the New Testament was happening during recorded history. It was happening during recorded, Roman history, right? So right away, everyone could say, but that wasn't when the census was. Right? And no Roman census would require everyone to go back home to their original hometown, because it would be a nightmare, right? So that's why the Catholic Church came up with the idea of a theologumenon, a religious truth, because a theolegumenon doesn't have to be a historical truth, it's a religious truth. So they came up with this idea, and we didn't, because we didn't need it. You can have a religious truth, it's not a historical truth. The ask is religious truths or historical truths, period, right? It would be nice to be able to borrow that idea, but we kind of can't. So this is what we're with. This is where we're left. We've got to kind of look at the chronology and say, how are we going to do this? All right. Now, by the way, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work well with the midrash, right? We're all used to the idea that Esther was the mother of Darius, and he allowed the rebuilding of the temple, right? And then you would have to put Achashverosh in here somehow. You can say, well, really, he was Kanbuzi, right? And he's just called Achashverosh in the Megillah. There are all sorts of ways to try and force it in, okay? The big problem is, again, that to have this kind of allowed massacre of Jews was not particularly typical of the Persian Empire. By not particularly typical, I mean completely not typical, completely atypical to what you would expect from the Persian Empire, given the way they ran things, right? They ran things with multiple ethnicities, where people could go home. Like it doesn't match kind of the Persian Empire thing. What it does match, and Adele Berlin points this out, is it matches stories that we have. So for example, in the Daniel story, we also have a story of a Jew in a Gentile court, Babylonian, then Persian, right? And advisors are out to get him, right? And in the end, they get the punishment that they designed for him. Okay, so that's a similar setup. We have other stories of like court stories, what's going on in a royal court with a wise advisor, that sort of thing. That's something that we have very frequently in stories of this period. And by of this period, I mean this period, this whole Persian period. In other words, the fact that this matches stories that are also, you can also see later in the Hellenistic period, doesn't make it Hellenistic. We have stories like this that go all the way back. Remember that this period, the 500s here, is also where we have all these great plays of Athens, et cetera, et cetera. And there, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And there we actually see that they have a lot of the same themes when they're talking about Persia. So for example, here I'm gonna quote, this is a quote of a quote. This is Del Berlin quoting Tuplin, who's talking about the Athenian picture of Persia. It says they possess, so this is what people in Athens thought of Persia. They possess a large empire whose only other physical, flora, or faunal characteristics are extremes of heat and cold, mountains, citrus fruit, camels, horses, peacocks, cocks, perhaps lions for hunting, paradisoi, road systems measured in parasangs and traveled by escorted ambassadors and official messengers. There is great wealth. Persians are liable to pride, hauteur, and inaccessibility. They enjoy a luxurious lifestyle, exemplified by clothing, textiles, food and drink, tableware, means of transport, fans and flywhists and furniture in a positively organized, regimented fashion. But the queens are sexually virtuous and sometimes energetically warlike. Their polity is defined by a tyrannical ideology and systems of deferential behavior and hierarchical control which deny equality. They value mere power and are inimical to the principle of law, except that there have been good Persian kings to whom some of this does not apply. Eunuchs will be encountered, and impalement or crucifixion is employed as a punishment. Okay, so this is what Tuplin says about, without connecting to the Megillah at all. He's talking about this is what Athenians say about Persia. Now we're already recognizing a lot of things that we see in the Megillah: the richness, the fabric, the table utensils, the tremendous feasts. You've got eunuchs all over the place, right? The numerous concubines, by the way, is something that people complain about when Alexander the Great takes on Persian customs. One of the things they point to is a multiplicity of concubines, right? So there are certain things that everyone knows about the Persian Empire that we see very much of in the Megillah, okay? What else do we see that's typical of the Persian Empire? The Persian Empire was known for its tremendous the best thing to call is a Pony Express. You guys remember the Pony Express? You switch from one horse to the other so that you can get mail quickly from one end of the country to the other. The Persian Empire's messenger system was a wonder of the ancient world. How do they do it? They really actually had a Pony Express. You would switch horses, and they would manage to get messages that way from one end of the empire to the other. And the empire was huge, as we said, Mihodu Viad Kush, from India to Nubia. Okay. So they were known for this, and this was in fact something. And this is a feature of the Megillah. They're sending out messages. They send them out quickly, right? Right? They're rushed with the word of the king, right? In all of the different languages. This was also something the Persian Empire included a huge number of ethnicities, a huge number of languages, and this tremendous messenger system. Okay. Also, of course, there are numerous words that we have that are Persian words. Dat is a very, for the law, and we see dat also used similarly in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we have certain things that were very typical. Also, the fact that their women, the Persian women, were supposed to be fairly aggressive and confident, and we see what Vashti does, where she's like, "No, I'm not coming." Now, the fact is that I do want to do an aside here about Vashti's decision, okay? Because Vashti's decision seems unbelievably stupid, all right? If you are a queen and you know the system of government and you know how little power you have opposite the king, and he says, I want you to show yourself now, I'm with all my guys. And even though, yes, we interpret, she just the crown, all he says is that she should come in the crown. He says, come in your crown. Now, obviously, yes, he wants her to perform like a monkey, right? He's like, I tell you what to do and you come, wear the crown, right? At the same time, it's not clear why doesn't she want to come if she knows what could happen to her? Now, we actually don't know what could happen to her. She could have been exiled. It doesn't say that she was killed. It doesn't say explicitly that she was killed, but we know that you got rid of her. Okay. If she knew that this was what was at stake, why would she do this? I once read a very disappointing book on game theory in the Bible. But I was very disappointed because if you know game theory, you know that you need to give values to everything in order to know what someone's going to choose. And what did game theory without values. You can't do that. That doesn't work. So we came to this conclusion that Vashti was a tremendous feminist who would rather die than submit. And I would say, let's look at the verse. What was Vashti in the middle of when she did this? Right? She also had a drinking party for women, right? So it was just women, but they're having a drinking party. A mishteh is not just a party. A mishteh has the word drink in it. It's a drinking party. Vashti was drunk. She wasn't making logical decisions. She made a stupid decision. She'd been drinking, right? I really do think so. And you can argue with it and say, well, it's just a story. In the integrity of the story, she'd been drinking. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sort of sense, all right? And so she says, no way, I'm not coming. I'm going to pause for a second and look at some of the other questions. Where would I place the prophet Malachi? The prophet Malachi is talking when there's a functioning Beit HaMikdash. Okay, he's talking after Zechariah and Haggai. Okay, well after, because he's taking a functioning temple. He's assuming that it's working, right? He's assuming the temple is working, and the problem is that the sacrifices are terrible. That's the big problem. The sacrifices suck. They're just awful. And how could you do this? Okay, so whereas Haggai and Zechariah, they're big battles to get the thing built. Malachi is already speaking when it's built. Now that doesn't narrow it down very much. As you saw, there's this very long Persian chronology while the temple's built. So it doesn't help us narrow it down very much, but he's certainly well after Haggai and Zechariah. Under which Persian king are Zerubbabel and Yoshua the high priest? They're under here, let me show you. I'll share my screen again. Hold on. Okay, so here Zerubbabel and Yoshua are under Darius. They start rebuilding under Darius. That's why they need to say, could look in the archives and you'll see that Cyrus allowed us, because Cyrus already granted permission to build, not just to go home, but also to rebuild. And that's why the Cyrus cylinder is so important, because you have a very similar kind of system that he's using with the Babylonians. Yes, build your temple to Marduk, and Marduk told me to do this and all this stuff. So you have a similar thing here, where Cyrus from the beginning said rebuild your temple, right? But they didn't. And so Darius gives them, Darius checks the archives and said, oh yes, absolutely, and he funds it. Okay, Darius very much wants to pay himself also as a continuation of Cyrus. So that's when they rebuild. Famously, Zerubbabel and Yoshua, they're certainly there at the beginning, and we don't see them at the end, right? We don't know if that's because in Ezra and Nehemiah, it has a very different approach to the role of Zerubbabel, whereas Haggai and Zechariah see Zerubbabel as the Mashiach, as the Messianic king, right? Ezra and Nehemiah are not pushing. The book of Ezra really does not push this idea at all. So it does make sense that maybe it wouldn't mention Zerubbabel at the final building of the Beit HaMikdash, or Zerubbabel was recalled maybe back to Babylonia, which one would expect with someone who was suddenly being hailed as a Messianic king. You would expect them to kind of recall him from being a governor. And also governors in the Persian Empire were recalled at regular intervals so that they didn't gain too much power. So that would have my vote. Back to your questions. It would have been convenient if Yom Nicanor had lasted. I say so too, but I don't like fasts. The Proto-Hanukkah and Purim would probably have ended up getting merged into a single holiday since they're on consecutive days. That's a good point. That would have been interesting. It would be interesting to see this kind of merging of the Hanukkah idea and the Purim idea as the two additional holidays that we have after the Torah. That would be interesting. Maybe Kish, Mordechai's grandfather, was exiled. You're saying that, hold on. So if I'm reading this, I see what you're saying. So
it makes a lot of sense with the verse.
Right. So this is the way David is reading the verse. He's reading it. I'm reading it in Hebrew. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira. There was a Jewish man in Shushan habira. Ushmor Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimei ben Kish Ishmini, and his name was Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. Okay, Benjaminite. Asher Haglam Yerushalayim im Hagolah Asher Haglata im Yechoniah melech Yehuda. That was exiled from Jerusalem with the exile that was exiled with Yechoniah, the king of Yehuda. So if you said that it's actually his grandfather, right? If you say there was Kish who was exiled, right?
His great grandfather.
You're right. It's his great grandfather, because he's the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. Right. So you say, well, if it's Kish that was exiled, then it's no problem. We can get right down to Achashverosh. That would solve it. We're going to talk a little bit about the Kish connection in just a sec. Okay, because then we have the whole Saul parallel, which is very interesting. There's a Benjaminite strand in the Megillah that is worthwhile talking about. Who wrote that description of the Persians? The person who wrote, just a second, the person who wrote the description of the Persians that I read to you. Just a moment, I will tell you. Okay, that was Tuplin, Christopher Tuplin, who investigated references to Persians in the works of Greek dramatists, philosophers, and orators. Okay, that was his summary of what these Athenians. Remember that when we talk about Socrates and stuff, all these people, Sophocles, Alcibiades, right? They're all in Athens. Right, so we're talking about Athenians, not just like Greeks in general. And so he's summarizing what the Athenians were saying about Persia. Let's see. Okay, there was a question. Joel, you had a question?
Just in general, I remember in junior high, one of the teachers made I always have flashbacks in these classes of school, but he just made a comment that there were 200 years where the rabbis couldn't figure out It was almost enigmatic. They couldn't figure out the chronology. Then they figured it out, and then he ended the subject like we weren't supposed to talk about.
I would do the same thing. I would just end the subject. Then we figured it out. We're done. Because what do? People would come up to me. People used to come up to me before I had taught this stuff. People would come up to me and say, "So how do you explain the Persian chronology?" And I would be like, no. I can't do it. I can't even attack it. At least now I can kind of say, okay, this is kind of what happened. But that's the big problem. The big problem is it really gets into a mess with Persian chronology. And again, it's because Seder Olam Rabbah just shortened it tremendously so that everything would work easily. Because honestly, if you're reading, it does sound like, even though, you could say maybe it was Kish who was exiled, it's natural things to read that it was Mordechai who was exiled. And then you have a real problem with that kind of, with the Persian chronology that we have. And that's why he kind of shortens everything the way that he does. And it's interesting, I have to say that I can't say it's just the Seder Olam Rabbah who does it. If I've talked about the book, there's a book called Fourth Ezra. It called itself Ezra, right? And or whatever it called itself, but it's written in the name of Ezra. It's supposed to be Ezra speaking. And it's Ezra who is seeing the first temple destroyed. And it's him reacting to the first temple being destroyed. Now, for you to think that that's even possible as a story, you have to really shorten that time period, right? You have to really shorten the whole Persian chronology to say that Ezra saw the destruction of the first temple, right? So, and it doesn't, now, I don't know how seriously you're supposed to take the book that is supposed to be Ezra, but that's the way it's presenting itself. That was written right after the destruction of the second temple. It's a book that's trying to deal with the destruction of the second temple by having its hero deal with the destruction of the first temple, right? So, and it's Ezra. The person who's speaking, the person who's dealing with things is Ezra. So I don't think it's just Seder Olam Rabbah who shortened the chronology. In other words, there's a long tradition of shortening that chronology. So if in fact, if we're going to already talk about Kish, so Kish is one of the connections. One of the things that's interesting about the Megillah also is the Benjaminite connection, right? So what do I mean? Mordechai is from Kish. Who else is from Kish?
Saul.
Right. Saul is from Kish. Shaul is the son of Kish, right? So we already have that Saul connection. And who does he go up against? The descendant of?
Amalek.
Amalek, but does it say Amalek in the Megillah? What does it say in the Megillah?
Agag,
the king of Amalek that Shaul went up against and almost didn't kill until Shmuel's like, no, you're killing him, right? Shmuel's like, okay, you're dead, right? But Shaul originally hadn't killed him yet. So Shaul went up against Agag, and now there's kind of this redemption of that story by having the Mordechai go up against Haman and win. Descendant of Kish go up against the descendant of Agag, right, from Amalek, and win. And not only that, and this last thing I didn't think of myself, I got it from Adele Berlin, the fact that it says, and the Jews didn't take any spoils, right, in the battle that they won, is parallel to what they were not supposed to do when they fought Amalek, but did do, right? They were not supposed to take any spoils when they fought Amalek, but Shmuel says, what is the noise of these sheep that I hear? More really says, meh, right, Hakol, right? But what is the sound of these sheep that I hear if you got rid of everything? And the answer was, no, we're going to sacrifice them. We're going to, right? But we couldn't just get rid of them, right? So they didn't take spoils this time. And again, we have that redemption. So we have certain parallels. I see that Ido is saying, but it cannot be the same Kish. Shaul ben Kish is 500 years earlier. I'm not saying it's the same Kish. I'm saying that mentioning Kish is a connection. It's supposed to remind you of Saul, and he's a Benjaminite, like Saul. You're supposed to see that connection. Now, there are also parallels to the Yosef story. And Yosef and Benjamin are considered connected. Benjamin is supposed to belong to the house of Yosef. We know that because I always forget the guy who cursed out David. And then when David comes back, he says, look, I am the first of Beit Yosef to come and greet you. And he himself is from Benjamin. So you know that Benjamin is considered to be part of the house of Yosef, of Joseph. And in fact, there are parallels between the Yosef story and the Megillah. Now, it's maybe not because of Benjamin, but maybe because you've got a Jew, a Hebrew, an Israelite in a foreign court. And so you have that story, and so you have certain parallels. But let's look at one linguistic parallel, which at least struck me. I'll share my screen for a sec. Okay, not this. Let's take a look at, here we are. Okay, so if you can see, this is the whole part of the Yosef story where Shimon has already been imprisoned, right, by Yosef in Egypt, and the brothers come back and they're like, we've got to take Binyamin, otherwise he's never going to believe us. And Yaakov is sure that if they take Binyamin is going to die, probably because he doesn't trust the brothers, right? He's like, I give you Binyamin's not coming back. And finally, they're like, look, we're going to starve to death. We're going to starve to death. We need to take Binyamin because it's the only way we can get food from Egypt. And he says, okay, do it. And he says, Va'ani kasher shachalti, right? And if I am bereaved of Binyamin, so I shall be bereaved. Va'ani kasher shachalti. What does the linguistically, what does that remind us of?
Avadati.
Right. Right.
Kasher
avadati. That's what Esther says. Right? Esther says, fine, I'll do it. And she has to be urged by Mordechai. No, you have to ask the king. And she finally says, fine. The kasher avadati. And if I'm lost, I'm lost. Right. And the linguistic parallel really strikes you that the situation is the same. Someone's doing something very reluctantly, and they're very sure that this carries tremendous risk. And they're like, well, there's nothing else to do. If I die, I die. If I lose Binyamin, I lose Binyamin. Right. And so that's a very clear parallel with Binyamin. And again, we have this kind of Binyamin thread. Now, it's interesting because there's a theory that in the Persian period, there was this kind of hope that maybe the future king would come from Binyamin. Maybe the future king would come from Saul's line. Not Binyamin, but Saul's line. Why do we think this might be so? Because in Divrei Yamim, in Chronicles, we actually have this long, I'm going to highlight it in English, or I'll highlight it in both, I guess. This long genealogy after Shaul. Okay, they trace Shaul's line after Shaul for about like 10 generations. So why are they doing this? Why do they care who descended from Shaul? Shaul didn't stay king. There seems to be a reason that they do care, right? They seem to have a reason to want to trace this line. Okay, so there's a theory that actually maybe there was a group that was hoping for a king from Binyamin. Right. And the way the story is written, it's very much a vindication of Binyamin. See, Binyamin did what it had to do. It finished Agag's line, right, the way it should. And in the battle, they did not take spoils. So I'm going to, let me just check to make sure that I don't have, just pause the share here. And I'm going to just check that I don't have comment. For some reason, when I share my screen, it's very hard for me to see the comments. Here we are. Okay, no more comments? Fine. So I'm just going to pause for a second in case anyone has questions and comments.
There's an advantage,
yeah.
Miriam.
Mm-hmm.
There's an advantage in having the person who's exiled be Kish because his descendants are already acclimated to the Persian life. And if it's Mordechai who's the exile, I don't know, he could get acclimated, but it's, I don't know, they're used to being in the country is the feeling you get from the
Yeah,
Megillah story.
It's interesting because in the Megillah story, Mordecai is a court Jew and he isn't a court Jew. Like, yeah, he sits at the gate. Like in the Daniel story, you know, he seems to be a judge of some kind. He's important, but you don't see him really be super active in court. He's mainly active through Esther, right? He goes to Esther and says, "Could you ask the king this? Could you ask the king that?" You know, he hears things. Hears things out in the country. Like he hears things and then he comes to tell her she's in the court, she's in the palace, she's in maybe the harem and she doesn't know what's going on, but she's his line to the king. It's interesting though. Let's take a look actually, and that brings me to some of the Nehemiah parallels that I'd like to come back to. Because Nehemiah is a court Jew. He's completely acclimated. If we're going to talk about someone who's several generations in, is a real part of the court. And in fact, this is one of the theories, and I've mentioned this before. The question is, okay, if we see the Cyrus cylinder, and then Cyrus cylinder is talking to the Babylonians, it makes sense that Cyrus would want to make nice to the Babylonians. The Babylonians was a big, important kingdom. You want the people to be happy. You don't want those guys to rebel. It makes sense that you really want to keep them happy. Why would he care so much of this tiny Judean people? They're tiny in this, then they want to let them go back to this tiny little rocky country, right? That's outside of the Fertile Crescent, right? Why would he care? Why would he write a proclamation? And there are two theories. One is that, well, it is in fact in between kind of Babylonia and Egypt. So as is frequently the case, we're the pathway. So you don't want people rebelling on the pathway, just keep them happy. And Judeans do tend to be rebellious. And the other possibility, the other theory, is that the Jews held enough important positions at court. He wanted to keep the court Jews happy, right? There were people in court positions where he's like, oh, you know what? I'll do this for you guys, you know? And what strengthens that idea is Nehemiah's position at court. We don't really have, as far as I know, any other real evidence that Jews had a particularly important position at court, except that Nehemiah really does. So let's take a quick look at that and some parallels in the Megillah. So I'm going to share my screen once again. Hold on. Now it's not letting me. Okay, just a second. Okay. All right, so let's see. I should have it open. It should be here. Okay. All right, so this is Nehemiah. He is serving Artaxerxes the king. Okay. He carries the wine. He took up the wine. He gave it to the king. And the king said, why is your countenance sad, as you are not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. It's not really sorrow of heart, it's ro'a lev. This is evil of heart, right? Then I was really afraid. You could understand. He's saying, what kind of evil thing are you thinking that you have this face on you, right? And he said, he says, Omar lamelech, hamelech lolam yechia, I made a king live forever. Madua lo yerufanai. Why? How can my face not be bad, right? When the city of the graveyards of my forefathers is in ruins and its gates are consumed with fire. Okay. And the king says, what are you asking for? Right? And says, and I prayed to God, because it's a very iffy thing to ask things for the king. And I said, Im al hamelech tov, if it's good for the king, v'im yitav avdecha lefanecha, and if your servant is good before you, asher tishlacheni el Yehuda el ir kivrot avotai ve'evnena, when you send me to Yehuda, to the city of the graveyards of my forefathers, and I will build it. Now, we actually know, because we've been reading Ezra and Nehemiah, there are letters earlier on that, in fact, there was a long-standing thing that they weren't allowed to build Jerusalem. So this is not a small request. At any rate, the king grants him the request. But this is a very clear, to me at least, there's a pretty clear parallel between this and Esther, right? where she says, right? It's almost the same language. If I found favor with the king, and if it's good for the king, may you give me my soul with my wish and my nation with my request. And then she says what the problem is. The order is different because Nehemiah starts with, how can I be happy? Right? And she also says similarly, where is it? I'm trying to find it now in the I'm gonna have to find it again. But at any rate, she says, and how could I see this happen to my nation, right? And Nehemiah similarly says, how can my face not be bad when this is the state of my city, right? So you have these real parallels between Nehemiah as a court Jew and Esther as a court Jew dealing with kings who can kill them at any moment. And how do you make a request of a Persian king? How do you make a request? This is how you do it. You say, if it's good for the king and may it please the king, how can I not, ask for this? How can I not ask for it, right? Works for Nehemiah and works for Esther, right? So I really do think that the way Esther's, I think the way it's presenting, first of all, it could absolutely, both could be based on the way one would approach a Persian king. And also you could say that the Esther, that maybe the Esther request draws from how Nehemiah has to approach a similar situation. There's another very interesting, yes.
The verse that you're looking for is Perek Chet Pasuk Vav.
Thank you. Here we are. Right? She says, for how can I endure to see the evil that came unto my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Right? This is, again, she's making a request. If it's good for the king, and if I found favor with him, almost the exact same words that Nehemiah uses, right? And if everything's okay for the king, right? And I'm good in his eyes. May he write, to return these messages that he sent out, essentially to kill all the Jews. And then she says, how can I stand to see the evil that will find my nation? How can I stand to see b'ovdan moladati, in the destruction of my birthplace? Very similarly to how Nehemiah says, how can my face not be bad if the place where my forefathers are buried is in ruins? Okay, so it's that a very similar structure there. A more striking parallel and a more meaningful parallel in a way is Purim itself. Okay, so let's take a quick look at that. I'm pausing for any more questions. Please don't put it in chat this time. If you have a question, please ask. And meanwhile, I will flip to the next.
Not a question, but just a comment that the Panim Ra'im is an echo of Joseph's question to Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Tabachim when they wake up after they've had their scary dream.
Why is your face bad? Why is your face fallen? Mm-hmm. So you mean that in the Nehemiah story, you mean?
Yes, sorry, yes.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, so it's that I think is trying to be kind of parallel the language more than anything. But I think that it's interesting to see these different kind of, again, court Jews. I mean, it's certainly when we talk about Esther, I always have this problem. When do you say Israelite? When you say Judahite? When do you say Jew? I'm not the only person who wonders this, but I think, again, I've said this before, but once we get to Esther and Nehemiah, you can call them Jews. Proof that you can call them Jews is that's what Mordechai is called, even though he's from Benjamin, right? He's called a Yehudi, which clearly does not mean a Judean, because he doesn't live, well, it could be a Judean. It could be someone from Judea, right? But someone from the tribe of Benjamin, right? But I think at this point we can call them Jews. We also have, of course, that thing that many of the people are mityahadim, because of the fear of the Jews. Mityahadim either means are becoming Jewish, right? Converting in some way, or possibly it means are pretending to be Jewish. The use of the hitpael to mean pretend to do something. Okay, they're mityahadim, they are pretending to be Jewish. But at any rate, it's clearly something that you can pretend to be, right? It's a Jew is something that you can pretend to be or can somehow transition. It's not clear. That this is always a question, like who at this time believes in conversion and who doesn't, right? Because there seems to be an argument about that. Can you bring someone in from outside, right? And you can't tell from the way Esther talks about it. For sure. You can lean one way or the other. So let's take a look. This is a very interesting parallel. Okay, if we look at here we are. So this is the scene where Ezra reads the Torah. Okay, he reads the Torah to everyone. What is the date of him reading the Torah? He reads it on the first day of the 7th month. What is the first day of the 7th month in biblical months?
Rosh Hashanah.
It's Rosh Hashanah, right. It's Rosh Hashanah, it's the holiday of the new year. So it's already a holiday, okay? Whether or not they already know it's a holiday, they certainly know it's a holiday once they hear the Torah, right? Once they hear the Torah, it's right, they have to know it's a holiday, right? So he reads it, and what happens is they all cry, right? They're all sad, right? All the people, and Nehemiah, who was the Tirshata, and Ezra the priest, the scribe, and the Levites that taught the people. This, by the way, is where you have Nehemiah and Ezra in the same place. And the Levites that taught the people said unto all the people, "This day is holy unto the Lord your God. Mourn not nor weep." For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. Why did they weep? Probably because they hadn't been keeping it, right? They were like, "Oh no." And they're like, no, it's a happy day. It's a happy day. Don't cry. Then he said unto them, "Go your way, eat." Now let's read the Hebrew. Eat fat and drink sweet stuff. V'shilchu manot le'en nachon lo, and send portions to anyone who doesn't have them ready. Ki kadosh hayom la'adonenu, because today is holy to our master. V'al te'atzevu ki chedvat Hashem hi ma'uschem, and don't be sad, because the joy of the Lord is your strength. Which is interesting, which is a completely new, it's almost completely new. You have the samachta b'chagecha, right? You should be happy in your holidays. This idea that what God really wants is you should be happy, and that's what God wants. And V'haLeviim said the Leviim made everyone sit to everyone be quiet. Lemor hasu, be quiet, right? Ki hayom kadosh v'al te'atzevu. Today's holy. Don't be sad. You shouldn't be sad on a holy day. Right? And so they all go, they all went to eat and to drink, and to send portions, to send manot, and to make a great joy, because they understood things they made known to them. So what's going on here? We absolutely understand in context why they have to be happy, why they should be eating, and why they need to send portions. Okay, it could be that they didn't even know about Rosh Hashanah, and that's part of the reason they were crying. This is a holy day, and they didn't even realize it. And say, no, it's a holy day. Be happy, eat well, drink well. Not drink alcoholic drink, but drink sweet things, right? I assume they could drink. They would drink wine anyway. And send portions to anyone who doesn't have, because they weren't ready for the holiday, because they didn't realize. Send portions to anyone who doesn't have, so everyone will be happy together, right? And then they come back, and then they see about Sukkot, right? They find out about Sukkot, right? And they keep Sukkot, right? But this is on Rosh Hashanah, right? And this is what happens. Now, if we go to the Megillah, to Megillat Esther, right? Is it here? Should be, yes, right. And what are they supposed to do? What's interesting is we have this tradition. It says, Kimu v'kiblu hayudim alehem, right? That they kept it and they accepted, the Jews accepted it on them. And there's that midrash that the Jews only accepted the Torah on Sinai because the mountain was hung over them. And when did they accept it freely? They accepted freely in Esther. Now, it's hard for me to believe that is not read together with the parallel that we have in Ezra and Nehemiah. The parallel that we have in Ezra and Nehemiah, where they just heard the Torah. They just heard the Torah in the parallel. They just heard the Torah, and now they have what? Eating and drinking a mishloach manot. And here they have eating and drinking a mishloach manot. Okay? And what now it's clear that the like if you had to compare and you had to say one of them original, which would the original be? What would make sense to the original? Well, usually when you have two parallels, you try to figure out the original. One of the rules is that the original is the one that makes where it makes sense in context. In other words, if we look at Nehemiah and you say to me, why is there mashloach manot? If you say to me, why is there mashloach manot in Purim? I say because it's nice, right? If you say, why was there mashloach manot in the story in Ezra and Nehemiah? Why? Because people didn't have. Right, it wasn't ready. People didn't have food ready, or maybe there were people who didn't have food, and it's a chag, and they have to send food out so everyone can celebrate. Right? There's a reason for mishloach manot. Why is it so important to be happy? Because people were sad because they didn't know, and so everyone was crying. So they had to say, no, be happy for the holiday. Okay, and so we're taking all those things that we know, by the way, that are all connected to accepting the Torah in the Persian period, right? And we're taking these things and we're putting them in Purim, all right? And then in the Midrashic story, when do we really accept the Torah out of free will? In Purim, right? So I think that it's absolutely reflecting this idea as well. In other words, the idea that we took aspects of this reading, right, of the Torah, we took aspects of that, the holiday aspects that are connected to it, and we put them in Purim, right? And that's something that we did. So I think that that's actually a very meaningful parallel. That to me, kind of, I mean, I like it a lot. To me, it's very meaningful. I want to make sure I'm not missing any of the parallels I wanted to talk about. But I think for the most part, that is those were the ones that I wanted to touch on. So we talked about some ideas about Persia that were generally accepted. Now, of course, there are a lot of also Persian words, right, in the Megillah, as is well known. This idea of a certain protocol with approaching the king. I do like, if you ever go to the Bible Lands Museum and you see a model, you'll see that model of the Persian palace with that long hallway to the throne. There's this throne and there's this unbelievably long path where from the entrance you are facing the throne, and there are these tall pillars on either side, and you can imagine the scene, right, where if someone's approaching the throne, how scary that would be, and how scary it's supposed to be, right? And so we talked about the problematic chronology. We talked about how there are aspects of the Persian Empire which you absolutely see kind of playing out in the story of Esther. We talked about the parallels with the Binyamin story, the Shaul story, and also with Nehemiah, right? In terms of Nehemiah's role as a court Jew, and also the kind of the accepting of the Torah in the Persian period. One thing we didn't talk about was the humor in the Book of Esther. Adele Berlin reads the Book of Esther as a comedy, which is not a surprise, right? It has certain funny scenes. One of the funniest being where Haman is falling on the bed to plead for his wife's life with Esther, and Achashverosh comes in. He's like, "Oh, and you're also trying to seduce my wife?" And we all get a good chuckle out of that one. And poor Haman is scared to death. But there are these comedic scenes. And she also points out the idea that all Midrashic explanations have also all picked up on this, and you can see it pretty clearly in the story. The idea that Haman wanting to wear the clothes of the king does indicate a kind of "I want to be king." And it does indicate something kind of inappropriate and threatening that Achashverosh reacts to, right? There's actually a story that I believe it's the Greeks tell about the Persians. I don't think I have it in front of me, but it's a where a Persian king has and it was a specific Persian king, I believe, and he has an assistant, and the assistant says, oh, and he gives him his coat is heavy, and he gives it to him. He says, don't put it on, right? And the guy puts it on because he's kind of stupid, and he puts it on, and he puts on all sorts of like women's jewelry, and he's like, yeah, okay, you can just be an idiot. Everyone knows you're a fool, right? Pretty much, like, because everyone knows you're an idiot. It's okay. I'm not going to kill you over this. That sort of thing. You want to, you wear my thing and be a clown, and wear the jewelry and be a woman, and I don't care. But the idea is that normally this would not be okay. This would not be acceptable. I see one question. I'm going to pause and take it. How do you date the writing, editing of the Megillah relative to Sefer Nehemiah, given the parallels? Okay, good question. All right, so there's a very wide range. Let's go back to our chronology. Let's go back to our chronology. Dun, dun. And I need to see it. I don't. Here it is. Okay. All right. So if we look at our chronology, Ezra and Nehemiah, the question is, when is Ezra and Nehemiah actually complete? So this is the problem, okay? You have something called within the book of Ezra that people call like Zichronot Nehemiah, like the kind of the memoirs of Nehemiah. You have the Nehemiah story that it seems like it was put into the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and combined with all this other stuff. And the same thing goes for the stories that have to do with Ezra, right? So they could have existed on their own before the final like editing, let's say. Now, of course, if let's say we put both Ezra and Nehemiah and Artaxerxes the first, right? Now again, in general, there's a general idea that Ezra could have been Artaxerxes the second, right? Which would move you up to like 358. In general, most academics are not going to date the Megillah to earlier than the 300s, right? So they're not going to date it to earlier, I think, than 400 BCE. I believe. Now, the truth is, it's not too hard to, like, you can have the Megillah and say, okay, this Megillah is not written right after Achashverosh. As it is, there's so much problematic about the Megillah that it's not too hard to have it written after. I think that the strongest parallel really is with the Ezra story where Ezra's reading the Torah. So then the problem is, and I admit this, here I'm building on, like, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah wants you to say that Ezra and Nehemiah are there at the same time. In the passage I just read you, Ezra and Nehemiah are both there. But it seems like Nehemiah is kind of shoehorned in, all right? In general, Nehemiah doesn't show up in Ezra's story, and Ezra doesn't show up in Nehemiah's story, which is why people don't, and you would expect them to. And Ezra gets a job, which is to set down the law for the people in Yehudah, that you wouldn't expect him to be able to do that if Nehemiah is the ruler there at the same time. It doesn't make sense, right? Nehemiah is pretty much setting down the law. Like, you see Nehemiah is very actively setting down rules for everyone. So it doesn't seem like they're both ruling at the same time. But the book wants you to think they are. So if you want to believe Ezra and Nehemiah, right, you'll put them both under the same Artaxerxes. If you're like, you know what, this doesn't really look like they're ruling at the same time, it looks like they're not there at the same time, and it makes more sense if they're under different Artaxerxes, or not, at least during different times, maybe under the same Artaxerxes, then it's easy to reach that conclusion from the book, but that's not what the book wants you to think, right? So I have to say that, like, it's important for me to make that distinction. So it's the Ezra's, if we say that Ezra's later than Nehemiah, right, which we would say if we look at the Kohen Gadol, a series of Kohanim Gedolim in the book that would put Ezra later. So then, we have to say that it's relatively, like, you could say it's late. You could still put Ezra in Artaxerxes the first if you want to, I think. And then Right. Yeah, because Artaxerxes the first lasts a long time. So and then you can maybe put the Megillah up relatively early. I don't see a lot. There's a whole bunch of people who think that Esther is Hellenistic. So putting it in the Persian period is already being pretty, which Adele Berlin does, for example. And I'm sure she's not the only one, but she's the one that I was looking at a lot. So she puts it in the Persian period. And that's one of the reasons why she likes looking at the Athenians, because the Athenians are living early on. Like it's not, if you find themes that are common to, you can say, oh, well, we find these themes in Hellenistic literature. Well, you find those things much earlier than Hellenistic literature too. You find these stories about how Persians lived this life of luxury earlier too, and it's also true. Like it also seems to be true that in fact this is how the Persian court lives. The Persian court has this kind of very over the top style that the Greeks are looking at, and they're like, I don't know, this is weird, right? But that's how the Persian court works. So and they already recognize this in the 500s. Okay. So I do kind of think that the Megillah would be later than the Ezra story. I think not necessarily later than the book, right? Because the book is when everything's put together, right? But it seems to me that this use of mishloach manot, the use of eating and drinking and being merry together with that, I think that idea is taken. I really do. It looks to me like it's taken. Now, you again, you don't have to accept that. You can say they're both parallel. Maybe they're both reflecting certain ideas, right? So Adele Berlin, for example, who she's not doing it because of a dating, because it would still work with dating, but she says, oh, this is the holiday. This is what makes a holiday, right? Because Esther is creating a holiday, so they are doing the same thing, that they're using the same elements that we see in Ezra and Nehemiah for creating a holiday, right? Except that here they're creating a holiday not for the Torah, right? And that's how she presents it. I think it's more than just elements of a holiday, because these are clearly in Ezra and Nehemiah, they're considered elements of a holiday, right? But they're taken out of context in Esther in order to reflect it. I really do think, it seems to me that in Esther, you're using these elements in order to build a holiday based on the story of a holiday that we know, right? And I actually like it because it does take me back to this whole Kimu v'Kiblu, they kept it and accepted it, being another acceptance of the Torah. Remind us of the Ezra acceptance of the Torah. So I actually like that. So yeah. Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, Miriam, are we saying that the Purim story is it's in the Persian period, but that it's written in the Hellenistic period? And
No. If we say, okay, so what I just said, the date that I just gave is kind of the earliest, we'd still put it in the Persian period. Okay.
It's in the
Adele Berlin thinks it was written in the Persian period. Okay. There are others who think it was written in the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic period, when I say Hellenistic period, and when we say Hellenistic period in this class, what we're talking about is the period after Alexander. So if we look at our chronology, okay, 333, you could say, starts the Hellenistic period, early Hellenistic period, right? Now it doesn't really, because we didn't suddenly become Hellenistic, right? Because when you really see the Hellenistic period is when Jews in Judea and Alexandria, right, are acting Hellenistic. They know Hellenistic ideas, they know Hellenistic stories. This really happens in Alexandria very strongly. It happens, and then of course it happens in Judea, because of course the whole world is Hellenized at that point. But it doesn't happen right at 333. Now Adele Berlin points out, I think correctly, that you don't have anything reacting to Hellenism or Hellenistic ideas or Hellenistic morality or anything like that in the Megillah, right? So there's no kind of recognition of Hellenism. And there's also, she feels that it's making fun of Persia, and it wouldn't make sense to make fun of Persia if Persia isn't the major power. If Persia's gone, it doesn't make sense to make fun of it the same way. right?
Mhm.
So that's also
I,
something that.
Well,
I would beg to differ. I would think that
Yeah,
from
I
I
liked her
would think
first idea. So hold on just a second. So I liked her first idea about the Hellenism not reacting to Hellenism, but I also think that yes, there's plenty of mocking to do once someone's gone. I haven't, once, especially when someone's defeated.
right.
Yeah, I think that there's still plenty of mocking that can happen. Yeah.
but how much after the events is the story written? If it's not
Okay,
written,
the problem is what events? My problem is how could this happen and no one ever reacts to it ever? In other words, there's nothing to indicate. You have Ezra Nehemiah quoting all sorts of letters. It doesn't quote any letter that has anything to do with any of this stuff, right? It's against Persian. It doesn't fit Persian policy. It doesn't like Adele Berlin is like no one's supposed to take this seriously. Adele Berlin's thing is like no one's supposed to believe this. The author doesn't mean for you to believe it. The author means for you to read it and laugh. They want you to read it and enjoy it, and then celebrate Purim because Purim's fun, right? Now, I would say that like the same way, like if I can say, okay, I can set a date by when Purim had to have happened, by when Purim had to have been a holiday. That doesn't set a date for the Megillah, because people can say, okay, right, like so like I can't argue with someone who says that the Megillah was written during the Hasmonean period. I can't say, but we know that Purim existed before the Hasmonean period, because we know from Second Maccabees that it already existed before they were even thinking of a day of Nicanor. And the answer would be, yeah, that's the day of Mordechai, and then they had to come up with a story, right? Once you kind of throw everything away, then everything's up in the air, all right? So once you do that, you can't, there's just, so the big question is there is there some kind of historical core of this? That's where things get very difficult. I love to see historical cores and things. It's hard for me here. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't have had something happen that was more local in Shushan, right? In Susa. You could have had something more local in Susa that frankly the Judeans just didn't know about, that didn't even get to them, right? And it could be exaggerated here. Right? There could have been a pogrom in Shushan or something like that, or a planned pogrom. I could see that happening. I mean, there was a pogrom in Elephantine, right? During Darius II, there was an actual pogrom. Of course, they present it as that's when the Persian ruler was gone. The ruler of the area had left, and so the Egyptian local leader took advantage of that fact and had the pogrom. In other words, it didn't get the gushpanka, it didn't get the seal of approval from the real rulers, right? But that's typical of a letter to a ruler. They're never going to blame the ruler. They're always going to say, "Oh, and you guys weren't there, and that's how it happened." Right? That's kind of the way they're going to do it. So you could say, well, maybe something happened in Shushan and in Judea, they just didn't know that much about it, right? And it happened really in the exile. And the way the Megillah is written was interesting with the Megillah, and of course, we say this all the time, of course, that God's name isn't mentioned. And that's why when people say to me, why didn't these books, because I always talk about books that didn't make it into the Bible, and people are like, why did these books make it in? And I'm like, the bigger question is, how did Esther and Daniel make it in? That's the bigger question. The bigger question is not how these books didn't make it in. The question is, how did Esther make it in? It doesn't mention God, right? Oh, there's one other thing that I really want to share with you about the Megillah, and this is interesting. It says about Haman that he peeled Pur, right? And that's where you get Purim, that he cast lots, and it says v'nahafochu, right? It was the opposite, right? He thought that it would be a day of downfall, and it was v'nahafochu, and it was the opposite. In Akkadian soothsaying, it's not soothsaying, it's in Akkadian, like when they read livers, etc., there's something called a napichu. It's really napich. The u is a case ending, right? So it's napich and the u is a case ending, but you can say napichu if it's the subject. And napichu means, it could mean that or its opposite. It could mean the king is defeated, or it could mean the king is very successful, right? That's what napichu means. Now, it's not at all connected to nahafoch, right? But there's someone I know who works in Akkadian stuff, and he wrote an article saying maybe what's going, because they also use the puru, they use the word, they use the word pur, right, to mean some of this I'll call it soothsaying. It isn't really, right? And so they use the word puru, right, for poor. And he says they're using the word Purim to tell you, now we're going to kind of make fun of Akkadian stuff, right? Of this Akkadian, because everyone was doing this, and so he thought it was one way, but nahafochu, right? It was the opposite. It was napichu, right? So it was napich, right? It was the opposite. It was actually, he didn't know how to read the signs. So that's a cute reference that I thought it was kind of convincing. It was because it was two different words being used together that you also see in the Akkadian when they're trying to read signs in the Akkadian and what's going to happen in the future. So, and on that note, I will conclude unless there are questions.
Yeah, I'm always a troublemaker here. Anyway, I find it quite plausible that there might have been a pogrom or a planned pogrom.
Right.
The Book of Esther builds on.
Right.
I think it's also very, very plausible to think of the Book of Esther as a parody of Persian court life, making the Persian kings and courtiers a lot more corrupt, a lot more stupid than they actually were, in fact. But I think it's also perfectly plausible to say that the story might have been compiled in the Hellenistic period because Jews under Alexander and after Alexander might have been suspect in being too close to the Persian courts. So here the Jews are saying, no, we've got the story showing things under Persia weren't all that hunky-dory.
I wouldn't do that because the conclusion really makes it sound like Jews rule the world. I mean, honestly, the conclusion actually kind of makes you a little uncomfortable. Like, whoa, Esther, maybe like slow your roll. Like, it's really like, whoa, really? Another day to like kill anti-Semites? Like, I don't know. Like, I think you shake your head, but I feel like you're like, we're so used to the story, right? We're so used to the story, but I think that she just keeps on asking for stuff at the end, and she keeps getting it. Mordecai gets the king's ring. He can just do stuff now. Like, if I wanted to say how Jews don't have power, I wouldn't use the Megillah. Mm-hmm. Me personally, like, that's not what I would be using,
Point taken.
I think it would be a fun satire for Jews to read, right? They're like, ha ha ha, yeah, right, they're doing that, yeah, right? I don't think they can use it though as like apologetics, like for anyone else. And the fact is, it's written in Hebrew, right? It doesn't seem to be translated from another language. It's written in Hebrew. Of course, it's translated to Greek in the Septuagint, etc. But and I see the question, do I think it was written in Persia? I kind of don't think so, but honestly, if someone could show me good reasons, it's certainly not a hill I would die on or even climb up. I think that if you show me reasons, I mean, it has Persian words, it has Aramisms as well. It's written in Hebrew. It's written in a nice late biblical Hebrew. So I tend to think that it's not written in Persia, but again, I don't have a super strong reason to say that, really.
But there have.
Excuse
me.
Wait. Let Cheryl talk for a sec. Cheryl, go ahead.
But what's the motivation for writing this parody and then including it in the canon? There has to be something going on.
Two different questions. There are two different questions. Okay. One is why write it, and two is why include it in the canon. Okay.
Okay.
So those are two different questions, right? So this
Okay,
is the thing. So you can say it's written. So there are two possibilities. Let's there are more than two, but let's boil it down to two and let's look at each. So there's a possibility that there was a pogrom, a planned pogrom that was thwarted. And and based on that, the Megillah was written. Okay.
Mhm.
There's a possibility that someone wrote a parody to explain Purim, right? Which is a holiday already. Okay. And that holiday was a carnival holiday. And so they wrote this parody because it's funny. And then it got included because people were keeping the holiday. And so they're like, here's something that explains it, and let's put it in. Okay. It's hard to believe, because again, there's no mention of God, but if they're actually if everyone's keeping the holiday and here's something that explains it, they're like, okay, let's put it in. Or it was written to commemorate this pogrom that didn't happen. There was a holiday to commemorate the pogrom that didn't happen, right? And then it got into the Bible to explain this holiday. Or either, you can completely disconnect the holiday and the pogrom. You can say there's a holiday and there was a pogrom that didn't happen, and then they were connected, right? There's something that people make a big deal out of, which there's no reason to make a big deal out of, in my opinion, is that the Megillah wasn't found at Qumran. And there's no reason why you would find the Megillah at Qumran. Of course, they weren't keeping Purim. Purim as a holiday would be anathema to everything they stand for. And why in the world would they keep the Megillah, right? So that doesn't mean that the Megillah wasn't around. Like that's not proof of anything. I mean, it makes sense that they wouldn't keep the Megillah. They'd be like, this is a bogus holiday. It's a bogus Megillah. We're not gonna have anything to do with it. So it doesn't prove anything in terms of where it was written or where it was accepted. What we can say is that by the time of the Jude, look, obviously it makes it into the Septuagint, because the Septuagint keeps like everything, right? I shouldn't say that, but Septuagint keeps lots of stuff. But and it's totally in the same tone as other books in the Septuagint, where they're like good stories, right? Joseph and Usnat, like they're just as a fun romance, like let's read it, it's fun. And so it's but the fact is it makes it into Tanakh, it makes it into the Judean Hebrew Bible. And for it to make it into the Judean Hebrew Bible, I think it's the holiday connection is really what seals the deal, is that people are keeping Purim, right? And we already knew that, frankly, we already knew people were keeping Purim because already before we have Hanukkah, they have Yom Nicanor, and to mark Yom Nicanor, they're like, it is the day before Yom Mordechai, because everyone knows when Yom Mordechai is, right? When the day of Mordechai is. So we know that the holiday was around. And probably that's why this book made it into Tanakh, to explain the holiday. Then you can say, well, then why don't we have a book that made it in to explain Hanukkah? Because there are books that explain Hanukkah. Why not put that in? And I think that brings us back to the good old, there was no prophecy, so there couldn't have been Ruach HaKodesh, like this Holy Spirit that inspires divine works and Hanukkah. But if you say this work comes from the Persian period, especially if you place it, like if you read this book and if you were read the Megillah and you weren't reading anything else, you would be like, and I said to you, did it happen before the temple was rebuilt? You would say, absolutely. 100% you would say, right? It's between the exile and the temple. So if that puts it in the Persian period before the return to Zion, you are solid, right? You still got like divinely inspired works then. Whereas when it comes to the stories of Hanukkah, that's very clearly after that period. There's no more prophecy. There's no more divine inspiration. Those are just books. So they easily make it into the Septuagint, but they don't make it into the Judean Bible.
Okay. All right. There are elements of Purim that are like Mardi Gras. Does that happen later?
Yes. Okay, so this is if you ask an academic, they'll say, yeah, that because Purim's a carnival holiday. That's what it is. It's the carnival holiday, and it works. Let's switch all the rules and it's interesting because it's interesting what happens in Eastern, at least in Eastern Europe, where it really does become this thing where on Purim is when the beggars kind of dress up and they all storm the house of the richest man in the town, and he's got to pay them off or they won't leave, that sort of thing, right? Because it's like let's reverse everything. And the Purim spiel traditionally had a very good looking guy as Haman. The best looking man would be Haman, and the kind of Mordechai was this kind of sniveling, and when Haman would make his speech before being killed, women in the audience would cry, right? Because Haman was this noble figure, because they would reverse everything. Let's reverse everything. So they would make Haman this like noble, well-spoken, aristocratic figure who would make this beautiful speech before being killed. And that was like an aspect of the Purim spiel. That was like what a Purim spiel was. So this whole thing of reversal, all sorts of it was very much an aspect of Purim. And it's an aspect of the Megillah, the reversal, and kind of how silly these rules are, right? Because they're not supposed to be reversed, but they are reversed, and this king's an idiot, right? Or he's not great. He's not a genius, right? He's not quite the fool that we talk about him as, but he's not a genius. And so making fun of kind of these rules. So there's a big piece of that in Purim. Like the costume, and then the costumes go along with that because everyone's used to a carnival. In all the countries where people are used to this idea of carnival, you always have these costumes, right? So the costumes just kind of connect to it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
In Yerushalmi, in his book Zachor, says that that cities, if they were saved in Eastern Europe or Europe, cities that were saved from a destruction instituted their own like Purim celebration to commemorate their own city being rescued.
Yeah. There's so many local holidays, local fasts also, unfortunately, for all sorts of different tragedies that we've just lost. I mean, but yes, they would have their own Purims, and I mean, that's great. I mean, it's interesting, even in terms of just before we get to Europe, all these holidays, like the Day of Nicanor, which is in Megillat Taniot, like it's listed as a holiday, and these things we just don't keep anymore. But anyway, so thank you everyone for joining me.
Just
have
one
a good night.
One last thing. Yeah.
Yes.
We were talking. You were talking about the danger of this picture of the Jews pulling the strings. If we're talking about comparisons between the Purim story and the Joseph story, there seems to be perhaps an overarching lesson in Jewish history when you compare Al tidami b'nafshech imalet bet hamelech, an admonition that's coming from Mordechai the court Jew, with Vayakam melech hadash asher lo yada et Yosef.
Yeah, you say yes. Yes, that's nice. There's an idea that you may think
Jews should
you're
never
on top
feel
of the
too
world,
comfortable.
right? You may think you're on top of the world because you're in the royal court, but if you don't have God, you've got nothing, and you can fall at any time, right? Yeah. I mean, and it's always interesting to me in the story of Esther that you could also be saying, look, if you don't do this, so we'll get saved from another direction, and your house will be lost. And yes, her house will be lost because she's married to a king that doesn't even know her identity, and that's the end of her line, essentially. And that's her house, which is her family, which is the house that she comes from. What will it have been for, right? If she doesn't step up and save the Jews. So that's also always an interesting idea. So thank you everyone for joining me, and have a good night and have a happy Purim. I hope you enjoyed this class. I certainly enjoyed giving it. I was really looking forward to it. So have a good night and a happy Purim, everyone.